The next day, once the welcome party was over, everyone attended their classes. At the academy, the Ice and Fire Corps attended classes together. The teacher began giving a lecture to everyone. They all took out their notebooks and started copying down the most important points with great attention. Through this method, a competitive structure for secure elites was created, thus increasing concentration among students, and it was the policy of the academy. The combat theory professor named Vencimore closed the book and with a serious look marked the end of the lecture on the culture of the barbarian tribe. Now that the lecture was over, the students couldn't help but feel somewhat relaxed. Based on the discovered locations of the barbarian tribe, the professor asked everyone if anyone could tell him their hypothesis about the location of the barbarian tribe's fortress. Upon hearing this question, many began to avert their gaze to avoid answering. From Ice Corps class, Tudor opened his notebook, started scratching his head with his finger, and remembered that the location of the confrontation between Balak and the Empire had been at heights 1, 8 and 75 in front of southern region. Despite trying hard, he couldn't find an answer to Professor's question. From the Ice Corps class, Bianca put her hand under her chin, closed her eyes and started to think. She remembered that the areas where they had collided were all in low-altitude locations, and considering that it was a depression, she thought their fortress must be in a low-altitude region. While everyone was trying to find the answer, Sinclair stood up, raised her hand, and with a smile decided to answer the professor's question, leaving both Bianca and Tudor in shock. Seeing that she was Sinclair, rank 1 of the Fire Corps, Professor Vencimore, who had his arms behind his back, gave her permission to respond. With a cheerful smile, she explained that in the army, according to the public academy, the location of the close combat between the barbarian tribe and the Empire was in Highlands. She put her arms behind her back and continued with the explanation. Behind her sat Vikir. He closed his eyes and began to think. The 29 from yesterday, all of them had a strong stench of demons, and before dying, their faces had exploded. Vikir began to think deeply about why their faces had exploded. If this was the ability of an elite corpse hiding in this capital city, there was one place he could think of. He decided to ask Cindy Wendy to investigate around that area. While Vikir was deep in his thoughts, Piggy, who was sitting next to him, started tapping his shoulder with a look full of panic and began trying to get his attention. Not long after, the attention of almost all the students focused on Vikir, who were somewhat confused. The teacher couldn't help but become enraged and realized that the Ice Corps wasn't as good as the Fire Corps. He couldn't believe someone would dare sleep during the first class. Vikir started adjusting his glasses with his hand and explained to the teacher that he was not sleeping. Seeing that he had dared to respond to the teacher, Piggy couldn't help but be in shock. This made the teacher even angrier, and seeing that he had dared to respond, he asked him what his name was and told him that everyone had seen him with his eyes closed, asking if this was his excuse. Vikir remained calm and explained that his eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. Upon hearing this, the teacher admitted that he had been mistaken, and Vikir told him not to worry as it was understandable. The professor began to lose his patience, and with a look full of rage, he started to wonder what kind of psychopath had entered the academy. He sighed and decided that getting angry wasn't worth it. Due to the answer Sinclair had given, the Ice Corps had earned 1 point out of 10 in behavior points. If Vikir could answer his question, he was going to give him and the Ice Corps the points, leaving poor Sinclair somewhat surprised. The professor began pointing at Vikir with his finger and with a threatening look told him that if the answer was incorrect, the entire Ice Corps would get negative points. With a calm voice, Vikir refused since this was unfair, but the professor became enraged and still decided to ask him the question. He had to state the location of the Empire's army and where the Balak tribe had fought, and with that location, he had to tell him where he believed their fortress was. Sinclair sat down, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat worried because compared to other tribes, information about the Balaks was hard to obtain, so the difficulty of the question was really high. Bianca couldn't help but feel furious because due to Vikir everyone in Ice Corps would be lost. Vikir began to look at the ground and remain silent. He started imagining his friends from the Balak tribe eating meat. Several seconds later, he raised his head and with a smile decided to reveal the location of the fight between the Balak tribe and the Empire. He began to answer the professor's question, leaving Tudor and Bianca speechless. Vikir's answer was correct as the professor was shocked and even Sinclair was left without words. Vikir had revealed all this since after the Ahuman incident. The Balaks had moved their fortress since then, so for now there was no problem. Piggy began to sweat and was perplexed. He didn't know how Vikir knew the answer to such a complicated question. The professor put his hand under his chin and with a surprised look began to wonder how he knew about the thesis that had not been verified by the academic world. At that moment, the professor remembered that his name was Vikir, and upon doing so, his eyes filled with surprise and he couldn't help but start sweating, as he recalled that someone named Vikir had obtained first place in the theoretical exam. Now that Vikir's answer was correct, he earned 10 points while the rest of the Ice Corps earned 1 point. Tutor and Bianca began to observe Vikir and remained silent. The professor, who had his arms behind his back, mentioned that although he had obtained first place in the theoretical exam, he could not overlook the fact that he had his eyes closed during the lesson, so he decided to deduct 10 points. Vikir accepted this without complaint and decided to be more careful in the future. Sinclair began to look at Vikir. She had not realized that he had obtained first place in the exam since Vikir was a common name. While the sun's rays were entering the class through the window, Vikir stood up and remained silent. Tutor, who had his head resting on his hand, began to observe Vikir, and it didn't take long for him to realize that he was the one who had come first in the theoretical exam. But then he decided to stop thinking about him, since because of him almost all of Ice Corps ended up with a point deficit. Just seeing nerds like him made Tutor want to hit them. He couldn't help but start smiling at the thought that Vikir was the smartest when it came to theory. He began to wonder if this could be useful to him during practical lessons. Several hours later, the sun disappeared and the sky filled with clouds. Run flat was a sport with 20 people on each team. Points were obtained when the ball was in the goal area of the other team. The main equipment were some gloves and a ball. It was against the rules to use mana and weapons. Aside from this, it was a game where any method could be used to score goals. Someone wearing boots stomped hard on the ground. This person was none other than Tutor. He grabbed the ball and started running at great speed. Other players tried to take the ball away from him, but he was too fast. He grabbed the ball tightly and it started to shine. With a smile, he proclaimed himself as the best in Run Flat and thought this was his moment to shine. When they saw Tutor, the girls thought he was very hot and started cheering him on. While on the other side, Bianca thought this was a sport for barbarians. Tutor was so fast that no one could catch up to him. But at that moment, 3 blonde players appeared in front of him. They were the triplets. They began staring intently at Tutor, called him an arrogant bastard, and asked how he dared try to break through their defense barrier. Upon seeing the triplets, Tutor couldn't help but smile as he realized they were the troublesome triplets from the Iron Blood Swordsman family. Just before the triplets could make a move, Tutor moved at an incredible speed and dodged 2 of them, leaving them in shock. With a smile, he apologized to them since he hadn't planned on facing monsters directly. Seeing that Tutor was mocking them, they couldn't help but get angry and think this wasn't good. At that moment, the missing triplet number 3 appeared in front of him and with a determined look decided to take the ball from him. Tutor began to extend his hand backward and a powerful energy started to form in the palm of his hand. Using all his strength, he struck the triplet in the chest, causing his body to be thrown backward. Despite the fact that the triplets were strong, Tutor's blow was so powerful that he flew backward. Tutor, who had one hand extended toward him, couldn't help but start smiling even more if he had to face them. Then he didn't plan on losing. He started running towards the enemy base. He was very strong even without mana or weapons. He was the prodigy of Don Quixote Run Flat. Nobody on the enemy team was able to catch up with Tutor. For him there was no point in memorizing theory. If one was a true fighter, the only thing needed to win was strength. While he was running towards the enemy base, something caught his attention. In front of the base stood Vikir, and it didn't take him long to realize that he was the one from this morning's conference with Professor Venci. Vikir couldn't help but grit his teeth and feel somewhat annoyed since he had told the triplets not to send Tutor towards him. He simply decided to step aside. Tutor prepared to run even faster and decided to mock Vikir a little. He gained momentum, preparing to hit Vikir with his shoulder so that not only would he study, but also focus on training. While Tutor was slowly approaching, Vikir remained calm and began to look at the ground. Once Tutor hit Vikir using his shoulder, the one who went flying was himself since Vikir didn't even move from the spot. The impact was so strong that Tutor lost consciousness. Upon witnessing this, Sinclair and Bianca were shocked and couldn't help but feel concerned for Tutor. Several seconds later, his body fell behind Vikir. He began to observe him with a confused look and remained thinking in silence. He was planning to dodge, but didn't know why he had run towards him. He fell to the ground and started pretending to be in pain, and decided to fake being injured to raise suspicion. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.